This is Over the Mountains by Life Itself, a podcast exploring the understandings and system shifts needed to bring forth a second renaissance. This episode of Over the Mountain was recorded on the 21st January 2026, whilst the situation in Iran was unclear. The conversation begins with the protests in Iran and widens to include inequality, climate disruption, and AI. We explore what history suggests about how regime actually change, often requiring both mass dissatisfaction and fractures within elites, especially around the control of the military and media. And then we engage in a deep sense-making dialogue about whether real systemic change is still possible in an age of authoritarian resurgence, technological acceleration, and global instability. Welcome again to Over the Mountains. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about, in a way, sense-making about what's going on in the world. And how, I guess I've been watching the news, and it's often quite heartbreaking. And specifically at the moment, there's been this blockage of internet in Iran, about now 16,500 people apparently who died in the protest. Mm-hmm. And I guess when you see news like that, for me, I'm like, oh, will change ever happen? It's not the first time that the people of Iran have tried to overthrow their current government. And it seems that maybe there's an increase every time, but it hasn't changed. Now, maybe, 40 years is a short time in the perspective of history. And at the same time, it's also quite heartbreaking seeing the picture of people who died, young men, women, children. And I think that's also quite relevant for when we talk about a new world, a second renaissance. First, does that mean that we will need to experience also a moment of darkness? We seem that we're kind of going into a moment of darkness, or sometimes it can really feel like that. Looking at what's going on in the US with ICE, what happened in Venezuela, there's just like what's going on with AI, it's just like an overwhelming sense of like, God, is it, like one of having this faith that it might go bad at first before it gets better, but you have to maintain an act of faith. Yes. And I think particularly with the situation of Iran, and I like to look at history. I know you're so passionate about history of like, well, what has happened in the past? What are conditions that were there for a great moment of change to happen? Is there something to learn from the past? I think I started wanting to have this conversation with you because it just felt that also, as technology has increased and improved, those authoritarian government hold these technology that can oppress their people. That's relevant for Iran, like also the US, who's turning into a fascist country and has also these great weapons that can be turned against its own people. I look at North Korea, China, which is a very relevant topic for me as a Taiwanese. And so, I wanted to kind of go and sense make with you about like what's going on into the world. What are in the past have been maybe components that allow these changes to happen.
Yes.
And maybe finally, when I looked at, for example, the French Revolution, well, in my understanding of the history, there was a big uprise, but also the technology at that time were much more rudimentary, and the people were able to take over. And it wasn't, I don't know, as I feel like there's a technological gap also between the population and certain authoritarian government.
Yes.
It makes me quite scared. Of the repression of people's will, you know, where the current wants to go, where that life force wants to go. You can feel there's a life force that wants to go. And I think in all human beings, there is a calling for true deep freedom.
Yes.
And it breaks my heart just seeing all the picture of the young people or older people like who are giving their lives.
Yes.
So yeah, my thoughts are with them, because as today you and I are sitting in like comfort, you're expressing like, I think that thought appeared for me where we were sitting having noodles and you're like, we have such a blessed life. And yes, we do, but can I really have a blessed life when millions of others are dying and fighting for their freedom, let alone, you know, so what has been happening over the past years with Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Congo. It's just like, when you said that we have a blessed life, I couldn't really connect with it, because how can I be truly happy when I know there's millions who are in true deep suffering?
Yes.
I don't think we can't liberate ourselves without liberating others. I think that's also been one thing about the path that you and I are exploring in walking is inner transformation, yes, but you can't, it doesn't mean to like step away from looking at the world. Absolutely. Or engaging with the world. And even I think sometimes the space can seem like almost like a retreat from the world, of focusing on your inner being or trauma or your awakening.
Yes.
But where is the politics, you know? And I think politics starts by talking about politics, talking about these subjects and making sense together. Yes.
Yes. Wow.
So yeah, I guess why I want to ask you a couple of questions was like, yeah, what's your reading? Like, I guess, I don't know what was the question, how I asked you the question when we were back sitting.
What will happen in Iran? Or what,
yes, I was like, oh, what do you think would happen in Iran with like these countries that have so much...
which are authoritarian.
They're authoritarian and they're authoritarian, repressive to their population, and have such overwhelming military, technological advantage compared to their population.
Yeah. And maybe just first, you know, this courage, you know, that no one is free until all are free, I think. And yeah, just the courage of people right now, the thirst in the human heart, I think, for freedom. And I think just one thing in the beginning, before we get into the specifics of making sense, I think you're making some quite specific from this kind of not the big picture in our care. Well, this partly begins by engagement, and one of the engagements is to make sense of what's happening. Then it is to act. And I guess this was a lot of my life was animated by a sense of injustice from that level down to the level of the schoolyard, and trying to find ways of the highest leverage point. That was often my quest when I was, yes, I could go out and work for Human Rights Watch, or I could go and volunteer, but what are the leverage points? Where are the points that we can make difference? That was one of the things that led me to, open knowledge. I think the other thing that really, because I sometimes have despaired in my life, being a kind of activist and often losing even in this kind of political activism, not with my life on the line, but in just other things. I remember, again, I found it very powerful in the Buddhist teaching, just to say at the beginning, and I found it very well set out by Thich Nhat Hanh, and I think it was the heart of the Buddhist teaching, about impermanence. And impermanence is this core Buddhist teaching, and it might seem kind of negative. This form is going to dissolve. But the other way is that nothing lasts forever, including oppressive regimes, including people. Like Putin will one day die. Stalin died. Even people who are not overthrown pass away. And that aspect of impermanence is very reassuring. And I guess I am, in some sense, for those of you, a Whig in the version of history, or I'm a progressive. I believe there is underlying progress. I think of history as being like, there's the tide and there's the waves. Often, the up and down of the waves hides any movement of the tides. You don't notice the tide coming in because you're so taken by the troughs and the peaks. And we can look at history and think, oh no, we're going backwards. But in the long arc, at least since the great decline of the agricultural revolution, the rise of city-states and all kinds of inequality after Gathering Hunters, but at least for the last 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 years, I feel there has been a direction of greater freedom to some extent, or improvement in the human condition, here and there. It's very mixed. But just to say those two things are really important, that I remember, is impermanence, including oppressive regimes. Nothing is permanent. And there is hope if we look at the trajectory. Now, that doesn't guarantee that there can't be terrible breakdowns or kinds of or collapses. But okay, let's come to the sense making. So where would you like to start in that? Because as you say, it is part of our engagement in politics is to be thoughtful and thinking about what's happening, and to do that in, I would say, also a rigorous way.
Yes.
So one question is, what might happen?
What might happen in Iran, or what are the conditions needed for maybe such a regime to change?
I think being a rigorous revolutionary is a good thing, or whatever you mean, or a rigorous progressive. When we want change, we might not want revolutions of the violent kind. We can come to that. But in terms of systemic change, we want to ask, what are the causes and conditions that support that? And because often there is, frankly, sometimes just wishful thinking, there's protests, this time will happen or not. But also, if we do want to affect systemic change over time, how does that come about? Regarding Iran, I am not a deep expert on Iran. I know a little about the history, and obviously this period opened with a moment of great hope in 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah, who at the time, who was, kind of a king, exploitative, certainly wasn't very democratic, and had a secret police that tortured people and things like that. And it was a moment of great celebration in Iran. And obviously, one of the classic tragedies that often happens in history is there's an overthrow of one regime, and what hopes will come forth is a better, more liberal or more free or more democratic regime. And in this case, it obviously became a theocracy under Ayatollah Khomeini. And also there's been a classic story in this, the context of this, as I understand, is after the kind of reform efforts in the 90s with Khatami. Basically, there's been a general shift of conservatism and repression. And in fact, most, reformists who were at least allowed even by the regime have been sidelined. When they were elected, the election has been nullified or things like that. Now, the basic question is, you need mass protests, which is what's happening right now. And perhaps on a scale, what's exciting, you might say, or possible right now, is that these protests seem to be on a scale not really seen before though there have been a series of protests over the last couple of decades, including 1-2 years ago, and there seem to be increasing frequency. And this one has a broad-based, it's coming from shopkeepers, it's coming from students, it's coming from, old and young. It's quite broad-based, whereas previous protest about headscarves wasn't maybe as broad-based. The big issue is that what we're going to do here in terms of sense-making and making sense of things is one wants to have this there's the micro, there's the detail of what's happening, then we want to look back at principles. And generally, to have successful regime change against an oppressive regime, you normally need two things. You need mass dissatisfaction, normally leading to therefore protests. Mm-hmm. That you have in Iran, and it's often economically based. Go back to the French Revolution, bad harvests, mass dissatisfaction with the regime. But what you also need, and this is like Jack Goldstone and Peter Turchin's work, really, and others, you need elite dissatisfaction as well, or you need a lead in a minority of the elite who are up for as well leading the revolt or leading the regime change. And that's unclear in Iran. I mean, I, again, am not an expert in Iran, but that's the really big question. And you need a significant, that can also be helped if the existing dominant section of the elite is old or infighting or having problems amongst itself. And again, I don't know. Well, obviously the Ayatollah is very old. It's 86, I think now. I'm not clear from my reading at the moment of whether the group around him is that fractured. I mean, they've certainly got issues because the economy is continuing to have major issues. There's water shortages. There's all kinds of problems. But this is the key point. You need, as it were, the dry tinder. You need the forest to have been dry, but you also need this. You need a spark. But in a way, you also need oil. You need some and in this case, that's the question: is there an alternative elite? Because one of the problems that's been happening is that the reformists who have come along have basically been often eliminated. I mean, maybe they're not actually killed, but basically sidelined. And the other point to make is that oppressive regimes that are well established and which manage to at least keep their core elite happy and control normally the military are extremely difficult to overthrow. That has almost never happened. I mean, I might be exaggerating.
You mean that as long as the elite is pretty kept quite happy?
Yes, and the ruling elite, and they control the military, you've really got a problem. Even if, however significant your mass protests are, really. And that, I mean, so normally you need, Can you
give me an example?
Well, for example, it normally needs the elite for some reason to make a decision that they're giving up or changing in some way. So, I mean, the example, I guess, would be let's take South Africa for a period. I mean, it wasn't like, there was an armed wing of the ANC. However awful the apartheid regime was, what were the ANC using military force going to overthrow the South African army? No. And if the South African military and elite during apartheid were willing to continue gunning down innocent children, and they were willing to do that and continue doing that, it's quite difficult to get them out of power, no matter how awful it may seem. Because basically this is a collective action problem. It's true that obviously every, non-white person in South Africa had been willing to rise up, of course they would have taken over. I mean, the whites were a tiny minority, but that is a really difficult coordination problem. So even though it relates, by the way, to Over the Mountains and collective action, because essentially regime overthrow is a kind of collective action problem. We need to if we all go and protest on the streets, all of us, then they won't be able to put all of us in jail or kill, we'll overwhelm the security forces, clearly.
Well, sometimes you wonder with the technology that existing now, if
Well, if it include the military, for example, if enough people, like every person in the military has a sister, has a brother, has a parent. Normally that's obviously when regimes often crack, is when the military no longer will obey orders. But I'm just trying to say is that, say, taking South Africa, really it took the white regime for whatever reason, or a section. Again, there would have been hardliners. There were hardliners in South Africa, but it required some section to say, listen, this is not sustainable. We don't want to be, we've got this economic blockade. It's bad, there's a variety of other things. It's worth compromise. But in that case, even there, that was a regime that, yes, while they were willing to they tortured people, they did things, they were wanting to be part of the international community. They were wanting to trade. They had connections and so on.
So you're saying that some of the conditions are, as you need a protest, like the population, mass protest. So there needs to be enough of the population who are dissatisfied. Often there's a factor, an economical factor.
Yes.
And thirdly, you're saying that a section, at least a section of the elite, needs to also be dissatisfied.
Disaffected, exactly.
And the section of that elite that is linked with the military.
Well, they may or may not be linked with the military, but if you have those two, you've got a chance, because the elite in a way provide both leadership, normally of some kind, and, as you say, access. So they might control some of the armed forces, or they might, or even they're just a credible group that now can rally around. And then there's actually a fight over the control, of the media, of the military. And you see that, classically that was in Tiananmen Square, which is obviously a failed example of a mass protest leading to a shift in regime, where you were having sections, obviously, of the Politburo, also not the Politburo in China, but that group, there was a division, and there were some who were reformists who wanted to go and negotiate or talk to the students. And there were others who were hardliners, and ultimately the hardliners persuaded Deng Xiaoping to go with the hardline action. But you saw that fight going on, right? And that was what would have given the students a chance to win. If it had just been all of that group weren't even sympathetic, there'd have been no hope. That's one of the great tragedies of Tiananmen, is that there was a chance that the group, the reformers, could have won. And obviously other times they do, like, in the USSR, the reformers in the elite did kind of, in a way, under Gorbachev, win. Maybe they didn't even realize what they were exactly going to do. So
sometimes, what I hear is like, okay, maybe
so it's possible.
One, it's possible. Let me finish.
Yeah.
Also, I want to make a point that actually, different people have different rhythm. I think I think women are often a bit slower in terms of that. It takes time for us to digest the information, also emotionally, and not just talk about these things on a purely rational level, or conversational, intellectual, mental level. I guess some of what you're saying, I'm like, when you mentioned the USSR, I was like, well, and then Putin came along. Also in China, there was a period where China became a bit more reformist, especially around the 2008 Olympic game. And then Xi Jinping came along. There seems to be this kind of I don't know, one step forward, three step backward, one step forward, okay, you're now going three step backward, but maybe there could be a jump. And I'm trying to look at general tendency. And I think also in the space for young people, I think there's also, at least in the West, in the Western educated population, people who don't have kids, who don't have children, who sense a sense of despair, or, a feeling that disempowerment, that nothing will really change. And I guess why I'm also jumping to that point is that I think we're often talking about over the mountain to a second renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I feel like, wow, we're actually entering into a dark renaissance.
Yes, the dark ages before the rebirth.
Yes. And so how to go into maybe into this darkness while maintaining that sense of faith in humanity. I sense that actually there's many moments for me where I do have a sense of faith that beyond you and I just see the great love and joy and goodness in human beings.
Yes.
I see how I feel if sometimes I feel like I'm going old in the sense of like my thinking feels a bit like old school, and I can see there's new ways of thinking that is maybe more edgy or possibly advanced, and sometimes I have the reactivity towards it. But I can just see that no matter what, there is this like movement of life going forward.
Yes.
So a part of me feels greatly hopeful also. And at the same time, like concretely in the past 6 years, the amount of wars that have broken out, the inaction around the climate crisis is just astonishing. I knew that I had a sense that shit was going to hit the fan, but I didn't think it was going to hit that quickly, that fast. It's like a sense of chaos, and I'm trying to read the space as like the movement is increasing. How do you maintain like groundedness? Without also disengaging.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I feel like it's a practice in itself of like looking at the world, yet trying to maintain equilibrium and a sense of faith.
Yeah, connection and equilibrium at the same time. Yes. I mean, for me, I also think of what is like just the never give up on humanity. There is something really. There's also obviously darkness and so on, but there's real beauty. And I remember as a child, for some reason, watching a documentary about Stalin in the 1930s, the Gulag, and there's the millions of people that were killed. And just, it was about a woman whose husband was taken into their notorious prison. And I just remember crying and be so moved. And yet, it's so horrible what people did to each other. Families betraying each other as well, And yet, there was still hope and change. And you talk about Putin and so on. And it's true. And just to say, like, let's just remember, so there were countries that left the USSR that are now democracies. Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, the Ukraine. I mean, even Ukraine basically was an oligarchy until it was not going so well. I mean, there were elections, but it was very corrupt. I mean, and under Zelensky, it's been better. And there's the war. There's been the war, but just there is a thing, and the aspect is sometimes to look out, to zoom out. It's like a perspective of a tree when there's the winds come and it's winter, but spring can come again. And imagine Poland, Poland finally thought it was going to have its freedom in 1945, and then it gets, for 50 years, 45 years, it's under Russian and communist dictatorship. And the other point, which does really relate to Over the Mountains and Ours, is the cultural factors. But those countries in Eastern Europe that were liberated then after the end of the Soviet Union, and I would say, at least it's partly democratic, and there's corruption, there's all kinds of things, but there are mostly elections. That is building on a cultural history, and they're building a cultural history now. Or I think of Taiwan. China hasn't had a lot of history of democracy. and of an active civil society. There's been at least a version of kind of imperial hierarchical system for thousands of years. And in Taiwan, you know, it was different, and it was different from mainland China, but it was under Kuomintang. It was a one-party state. It even had a military dictatorship. And yet, in recent decades, they started to establish a very, very vibrant democracy. Now, maybe it's threatened, but just it shows you the change, like the attitude change. And you can feel it in Taiwan. Elderly people we've talked to, even in your family, they'll be like, when COVID happened, they're like, oh, China's so great, you know, mainland China, we'd like to join back with mainland China, you know, and the young people do not want that.
No, I don't think old people want to join back with mainland China. They just want to keep the status quo.
Yes, but
a lot of actually young people.
I've now said I've touched a button. My point I'm just trying to say is you could feel a change in attitude in the generation. So I'm just trying to say that's the other hope. And the thing that's difficult for us is we are used to things being very quick, and we would want them to be quick. We would never want someone to be in jail or an oppressive regime a day longer than necessary. What I'm trying to say is, in the perspective of human history, often things change in generations or decades or centuries, but we want to live in years or days. But and that hope comes as we look back out. We're like, wow, at least some of the tide of history. Now, there are dark ages where we go back. And I want to come to an aspect you said at the end, which is a bit the darkness, which is there's these deep tectonic things. They're very deep processes, the climate, or certain economic or social shifts. And obviously, there's real evidence in the past that climate breakdowns or shifts have been the cause of major issues. So famously, now in, I think, 16th, 17th century, there was this little ice age in the world for a variety of reasons. And there's a lot of evidence now of like that catalyzed, obviously, economic unrest, which then led to regime breakdown. You know, there were the 30 Years' War in Europe. There was actually big issues in China too, with the end of, I think, the Ming Dynasty, 1644. So you have these, so that's something that really matters. That stressor of climate change and disequilibrium, that is a major factor that if you look in the pattern of human history is a big risk. I think the other obviously is, you know, I think the other thing right now that's just so scary for me is that the powers that we now have as humanity, that we have of nuclear weapons, of bioweapons, of artificial intelligence, are so vast and so out of proportion to our wisdom as a human race, at least collectively, often. And so whether malicious actors or errors, or if there were some huge tension or civil wars, you know, that what will happen? And, you know, the analogy I have here is that in the 19th century, you had the American Civil War at a moment of great tension in the US, which we see now also. That was one of the bloodiest wars actually in human history proportionally, but of the 19th century. I mean, it rivaled the First World War in casualty rates, the American Civil War, in terms of the rates of death. The reason was it was the first time that new kind of weaponry, that the kind of quality of rifles, the rapidity of fire, the first machine guns almost were coming out, you know, artillery fire, you know, those things were being combined. And now obviously we have
how many deaths was there?
Hundreds of thousands. I mean, I think proportionally, I remember thinking, it is one of the, in terms of death rates of combatants and of the populations involved, it's actually one of the most.
Because I know China historically had also.
Well, and also in the 19th century, like the huge, the Taiping, and
But sorry, that point, why were
so what I'm saying that was that you were saying that there are driving forces right at the root, at the foundations right now, around climate change, around the rate of technological change, that are really, while there's this big picture of positivity, there's also these really big issues of concern, and that are intensifying conflicts. You know, even in the case of you might say, successful Syrian civil war in the end, in that the dictator was overthrown, the conflict there were multiple crop failures, probably associated with climate change. It was exacerbating conflict, and we're also in a world of very high population density in many places. So there are those concerns. But to come back was, if we were looking at sense now, and the hope for Iran would be that there is sufficient mass dissatisfaction combined with some elite, maybe a minority elite disaffection. And to come back to one other story there, in the Goldstone and Turchin point, is that there are these cycles that are happening. And I think this story is quite, so essentially what happens is inequality tends to rise in many societies over time. And you're seeing this at the moment in the Western world. Essentially the elite, for a variety of reasons, you know, often there's some reorganization, there's some regime change, there's some breakdown, whatever, and there's some reset. And then, you know, things go along quite productively, but at some point, often parts of the elite start basically appropriating more and more of the resources. And that then leads to growing immiseration of the majority. So as inequality rises, you get more poverty, and that then erupts into protests at some point. And the other thing that happens is elite overproduction. The very basic point of this is that people have, particularly the elite, too many children, relatively, if you like. And there's only so many positions. There's only so many, you know, generalships, this or that. And the way you can think of it was amongst the Mongols. You know, Genghis Khan would have 10 children, and they would have children. And at some point, well, they can't all be Khan. And then there's two of them will have a big fight, and then there's a reset. So, you know, the classic example actually Turchin gives at the moment is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is obviously a member of the elite, but he's a member of the elite who feels disenfranchised. He's not really part of the club.
He's looked down upon.
He's looked down upon. He's this brash outsider. He's never really get political and social power. I mean, you know, obviously now he has become president, but initially it's like, no, you know,
no one's
going to take him seriously. And he's a classic outsider president, right? We're going to drain the swamp. He's constantly, you know, disrespecting the mainstream elite. Remember, so that is, you know, this is a classic example where kind of an outsider, in this case, hasn't taken, like, it's not like military force, it's not like a civil war, but it's a kind of, you know, polite civil war that's happening of a kind.
Yeah.
And that's a classic example where there's been growing inequality. So think of Trump's base of support. A large part of Trump's base of support is, you know, middle class or white collar and blue collar Americans who've just been ravaged by this growing inequality, in which the middle of America has basically been eviscerated. And essentially wealth is either moving into the top 1%, top 10%, top 1%, top 0.1%, or pushing everyone down. And those are the core voting base for Trump. So it's a classic story of growing inequality leading to popular immiseration, combined with an elite minority who are willing to capitalize on that. And that's why you're in very complicated times in the US. And then currently the major elite keep thinking they're going to put things back together. I don't think they are. I think, you know, that I don't think that's on the card. There's going to be some significant rearrangement. I hope on the regressive end of things.
I think in some of this narrative or story, or maybe factual, like, I think the little people part of me is like a bit pissed that the elite has so much power.
Yes. The problem is that,
because in this narrative, it's like you need a section of the elite to kind of like, you know, want to change or feel like change. It's like,
yes, it's
almost like you feel like people didn't really matter.
Well, they do.
Like, and the question around democracy, you know, so some of the thing you say is, you know, maybe around climate at the end, maybe there's more awareness, but in a democracy, ultimately, people don't really care. Like they,
or not enough yet.
At the moment.
Well, it's not a clear impression. The problem with climate is just so hard. It's distant in time.
It feels
distant
abstract.
in space. It feels abstract. It's counterintuitive. It might actually get colder. What actually what's going to do is it's going to get more variable, which is not the same as just a unidirectional change. But just to say on that, to come back to the elite point, I do want to emphasize elite can include, we hear the middle class. I mean, Lenin is a member of the elite in the sense he's not an aristocrat and he's not in the military, but he's he's highly educated. Mao Zedong, school teacher. Often those people, Donald Trump is kind of the weird example because he is a rich person and so on. But often when I say by traditional elite was that including the 19th and 20th century, being literate and a school teacher would be a classic role. And so they're not normally people who are really bought into the elite, though that can happen. But they're people who are highly educated. And unfortunately, you often do need that. I mean, we know you're not. And so that doesn't mean you can't be working class, as I said, but you'd probably have been highly educated in some way or other. And I think things can change. This is the pattern of the past that they're describing. You've got to win control of the military and other key areas of power, the media, normally in traditional or means of communication. And that's also just the blunt fact. Like, guerrilla movements can fight for a long time, and sometimes they can defeat a well-organized military, but it's very rare if the elite can keep power. And that's my point about South Africa. The armed wing of the ANC was never going to overthrow the South African military. They needed the South African military to kind of, give up, in some way, and they succeeded in that. Incredibly, one of the most incredible victories, even if the situation in South Africa is still complex. But that's the issue, is that obviously in Iran, you basically need the military or some part of the elite that controls the military to defect. Because ultimately, how much, unless you really get everyone on the streets, and then at that point, normally the military defects anyway, because someone's brother, someone's sister, and they're not going to shoot all of those people. So you need that. That's not easy if your regime is well organized. So I think that, at the same time, I think when you look at human history, what's happening right now, I'm very hopeful, whether now or in the next decades, the elite has lost its legitimacy there to a great extent. It's now clinging on by the fact it may control some of the military, and that's loyal. But overall, it has lost already with these scale of protests and what people are now saying. Now, whether it will happen now, we can keep our fingers crossed and we stand each night and think of that. And as I said, I'm not a full expert. We need to interview someone and say, well, is there an Iranian elite section that's disaffected enough to provide leadership? And do you think some of the Revolutionary Guards or some other section of the military will defect? But that's the moment you're looking for. And it's also why they're shutting down the internet and all those things, because a mass collective movement needs to coordinate. Well, and also there's a key thing to maybe I just wanted to add, it's that one of the great shifts is when we move out of an authoritarian regime. And like the US is not, while people describe it as fascist or something like that, it's not fascist like China is fascist.
Yes.
It's nowhere close to that. And that what, at least about the press.
At the present moment.
Yeah. The thing is in the US, this is a really point, like cultural things matter. There are deep, deep cultural norms in the US, preserving freedom of the press and things. Now, those can go away. And they have, there's an example of, let's say, Germany after the First World War. But there's very few examples of a country with this deep-seated democratic and freedom-oriented, liberty-oriented norms in the US becoming like that. And the other really good news is when you are a regime that isn't like they're going to shoot protesters in the streets, these other things that we can be doing are much more effective. It's much easier to coordinate for collective action because you're not worried that your communication can be monitored and you're going to be sent immediately to jail or executed or tortured. that allows the space for collective action in favor of change in the world much more deeply. And the other thing, which I can leave as a controversial point here for future episodes, Sylvie's winking at me here, but it would be, well, this is a deep question, but obviously the US intervention in Iraq was deeply controversial in the 2000s. They did overthrow a dictator. Saddam Hussein was sort of, now who knows what's happened since? We can have a discussion about that. But I'm trying to say is that, you know, or the other way the regime change happens is sometimes, or even Venezuela. I mean, people right now, let's say something kind of maybe people don't, and I haven't investigated deeply, but, you know, Chavez and his successors were not great. They were dictators in Venezuela. They were running Venezuela into the ground. And it's kind of maybe welcome the shift. Now we'll see what happens. But one has to remember that. And that is the other thing, which is external pressure can make a difference. Sanctions make a difference. Sometimes even military intervention have made a difference in human history on the positive side of things, as well as the negative. And so sanctions in South Africa made a difference. You know, Putin is definitely losing support amongst at least some of the elite in Russia, for sure, out of what's going on at the moment because of the Ukraine. And that may make a real difference, even if it doesn't make a difference to Putin now. Putin will die at some point. And then there will be his successors, and they may even learn the lessons. Even if it's making no difference right now to ending the Ukrainian war, and I hope it is, in favor of Ukraine, it may make a difference to his successors. When they're like, well, look what happened. That wasn't great. You know, we won't do that. So you can't underestimate the impact it has. And also the impact at the end of every person who stands up for freedom makes a difference.
Well, there you touch a bit on Venezuela, and I guess, you know, there are different points there in terms of, like, you know, yes, he was a dictator, but there's a question of a country's sovereignty.
Yes.
And often also one thing we haven't talked about is, like, well, sometime a regime change because there's an external intervention, and often there's external intervention is not always doing that just out of benevolence. It's also they have, like, a personal interest in doing these things.
Well, I mean, this is a much deeper question. But for example, I used to be very anti the Vietnam War as a teenager. I read a lot about the Vietnam War. I thought it was one of the great mistakes of the US policy. I'm not so sure now. And this is a much bit longer discussion. And I don't know what the wise answer. I mean, obviously, the simplest Buddhist answer is non-violence. We shouldn't intervene with violence, at least in any situation. We can intervene even with our bodies. You know, we can intervene with our hearts, but we won't intervene with guns. That's a very wise position. I mean, there are issues with it we could discuss. I think maybe the end is I've always been very fascinated. What I liked most about Ian M. Banks, who's this science fiction writer and who wrote this whole series of culture novels that are very inspiring about a future with, you know, this very advanced technology and AI. The thing that I think most of his novels hinge on in the sci-fi realm is, should this kind of group called the culture, which is these very advanced human race, there's a group of it who basically go and intervene to make other societies better. And it's called Contact. And then there's even a special part of it. And I think part of what gives a lot of his books this twist and this kind of energetic twist to it is, what is the legitimacy of that? And many of the characters are grappling with that. Should they go and intervene in some other society that's barbaric or not? And in what way? Should they intervene with military force or not? You know, when they see torture and oppression, you know, or do they have to stand by and see it because that's the unfolding of that society? I mean, that's a very deep question. Who is anyone to judge anyone else or to make decisions for anyone else? I don't know. And, you know, that's a really difficult question. And it's one to maybe grapple with at another time. It's certainly been the case. And I think this is why I'm being not saying that I think in the postmodern energy particularly likes to like dunk on the US and dunk on that kind of imperial liberalism. Or, you know, because it was tight, you know, Britain was bringing, you know, civilization to the savages, you know, kind of, you know, oh, we're civilizing India. Well, we're also taking loads of stuff and, you know, so, and we're, you know, blowing up people on the ends of cannons when they revolt and things like that. And so it's got such a bad name. And at the same time, I think there's something where you're like, well, not that I'm justifying any of that colonization of any kind, but I'm saying, well, what do you do? I mean, surely the Second World War was an honourable cause. And many people today would say, well, I actually prefer the people who fought Hitler earlier. Or I think most people, certainly most postmodern liberals, would be like, wow, if people were like gassing millions of Jews in concentration camps, we would be justified in going and doing something about that. Or at least I hope they would. You know, we've all signed conventions on genocide and doing things about it, and then we don't do as much about it.
You can say that we're not doing very much about Palestine right now.
Yes. I think these are really difficult questions, but I think there are ones. I mean, I don't know if we have to talk about it in the abstract on this discussion, but I think how we hold these questions in a loving and yet powerful way, not only avoid them nor get into, you know, you're an Israeli lover, you're a Palestine lover, you know, like. What is the wise path on these things is really important. Unless maybe the answer then our ability to hold a dialogue about it. And I know this is one of the things we've dreamed of doing on this podcast and for some time, is like having a space for difficult questions.
Yeah.
Where that dialogue can happen.
Sitting after discomfort. Well, thank you very much for listening and sitting with us in making sense of this very troubled time in the world. My prayers are with just every human being who are experiencing deep suffering at the moment. Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening to us tonight. Keep following us for more sense making, both on the world, on what is needed to come true a second renaissance, and also how to walk that path in the everyday life.